my pleasure now to do, and I'm doing it very quickly, so I should say all four people in front of you are incredibly accomplished. And so I could now spend 25 minutes telling you and introducing them all, but none of us want, well, certainly they would not like that, and you all wouldn't like it because you'd rather hear what they have to say. So here are four brief intro bios for the four people you have in front of you. First, in alphabetical order, Ivan Gaskell, who is Professor of Cultural History and Museum Studies at the Bard Graduate Center, New York City. Mobilizing non-written traces of the past, he addresses intersections among history, art history, anthropology, and philosophy, as well as writing case studies ranging from 17th century Dutch and Flemish paintings, Native American baskets, and Congo textiles. He works on underlying philosophical questions. While on the faculty of Cambridge University, he edited the book series Cambridge Studies in Philosophy and the Arts with the late Salim Kemal. He has organized numerous exhibitions at Harvard University, where he taught and curated between 1991 and 2011. And then between 2002 and 2011, Gaskell and Laurel Ulrich collaborated on a series of seminars that culminated in the Harvard Gen Ed course, Tangible Things, that we are to hear so much about. Gaskell is the author, editor, or co-editor of 12 books and has contributed to numerous journals and edited volumes in history, art history, and philosophy. Sara Schechner, at the end there, is the David P. Wheatland Curator of the Collection of Historical Scientific Instruments and a lecturer on the history of science and museum studies here at Harvard. She is the recipient of the Hazen Prize of the History of Science Society for a career of innovative object-based teaching. Her last major exhibition here, I hope all of you saw it, was fabulous, Body of Knowledge, A History of Anatomy in 3 parts, won the 2014 Great Exhibitions Award from the British Society for the History of Science. Sammy Van Gerbig here is exhibit designer and photographer at the Collection of Historical Scientific Instruments at Harvard University. Deeply interested in the intersection between art and science, she earned an MSc in the History of Science from the University of Oxford and a BA from Harvard University in Visual and Environmental Studies. Her recently designed exhibits include the aforementioned Body of Knowledge, Tangible Things, Wireless World, Marconi and the Making of Radio, and the Astrolabe, East and West. As a museum photographer, she has shot many thousands of objects for documentation, research, and publication over the last decade. And finally, Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, who is the 300th anniversary professor here at Harvard, where she has been since 1995. Formerly a professor of American history at the university. That's the other thing I do, is test out the mics. Okay, so I'm the sound check. Formerly a professor of American history at the University of New Hampshire, she is the author of Good Wives and numerous articles and essays on early American history. She won the Pulitzer Prize for History in 1991 for A Midwife's Tale, The Life of Martha Ballard, based on her diary, 1785 to 1812. And I love this. Born and raised in the Rocky Mountain West, she has lived in New England since 1960 and has described her fascination with the way New England history came to dominate national culture. As mentioned earlier, together with Ivan Gaskell, she developed the Tangible Things class and many other things that Tangible Things has become. And she is also the MC of this evening's event. Please join me in welcoming Laurel Ulrich.
Thanks, Jane. Can you all hear me? Yes. It's a thrill to be here tonight with my colleagues. We have worked together on many things in teaching. Particularly, Ivan and I have taught together for many years before we came up with the crazy idea of doing an exhibit using a couple of hundred objects from I don't know how many different Harvard collections. And that exhibit, Tangible Things, was accompanied by a general education course that we taught together. And then Sarah Carter who you're going to hear via video, and I taught it again, and Sara Schechner and I have done it again, and we continue to explore tangible things together. I'm sure you were all very curious about this fabulous, strange object that was on the poster and that I hope you can see on the screen. Is it up? Okay. Well, what is it? It belongs to the collections of Harvard's Museum of Comparative Zoology. Is it a bird? Doesn't look much like a zoological specimen. Is it an ethnographic object? A work of art? Does it represent nature or culture, to use one of Ivan's philosophical questions? These are the kinds of questions that we addressed in our book, Tangible Things, through a series of case studies focusing on objects that we described as objects in place, objects unplaced, objects out of place, and then concluded with objects in stories and stories in things. Our book has an argument, and that argument is that any object in Harvard's museums can be marshaled as a primary source in the study of history. In our courses, we invite students to begin by looking closely, and then we urge them to move outwards from the object to discover the many, many stories hidden in tangible things. Every object, no matter how common, tells a story, and most objects tell many stories. So this evening, rather than go through our book, we hope you'll read that, we decided to do a little case study, which is basically our method, by examining a very common object, really an accidental object, an object that isn't yet in any of Harvard's collections. It's on the stand here between Sammy and Ivan, and we call this our orphaned sewing machine. It's orphaned because Ivan and I borrowed it a number of years ago for a seminar that we were teaching. We wanted a machine, and when I went to return it to the kind person who loaned it to us, she said she didn't want it. So it's been living in my study in Widener for quite some time, and I've been trying to give it away. I could sell it on eBay, but I want it to be in a Harvard collection, but nobody thinks it belongs there. So what we're going to do this evening is try to make a case for the power of this tangible thing as an entry point into history. Sammy will begin by showing us what we mean by close looking. Then Ivan, I think I've got I'm forgetting my slides here. By close looking. Then Ivan is going to tell some stories about art. Sara Schechner, some stories about technology. I'm going to weigh in with a little bit about globalization. And then we're going to see a short video sent by our other colleague who was unable to be here this evening, Sarah Carter, who will tell us stories about furniture. And then your job is to listen to these arguments and come up with a conclusion about where our orphaned object belongs. Is there room for it in a Harvard collection? Sammy.
Good evening, everyone. Can you all hear me? Fantastic. Okay, so my name is Samantha Van Gerbig. I wear a lot of different hats over at the Collection of Historical Scientific Instruments, but one of the biggest is collection photographer. I've been working there now for over a decade, doing that kind of work, among other things. And I wanted to give you a little bit of a really brief background into myself. Like Jane said, I have a BA in visual environmental studies from here in Harvard, and my main focus there was photography and film animation, but I was also really, really convinced at the time that I wanted to be an observational astronomer. So I did a lot of science and history of science as well. I grew up the daughter of an antique dealer, and I grew up in a house filled with things, none of which were tangible. So I've always been interested in objects and wanted to surround myself with objects, and I kind of came up with a theory about theories when I was in college, which is that if there were too many theories about something, then I needed it to be concrete, two-dimensional, three-dimensional, but for me to really get interested in something, it had to be a thing and a tangible thing. So my skill set it's kooky, but it makes me really well suited to my job. And I was really excited to have a chance to work with these guys on the original Tangible Things exhibition. So we could begin talking about. So I actually didn't meet this sewing machine until very recently. I had seen similar objects before, but not this particular one. And so whenever I work with the curatorial staff at the collection, I like to think of my work as kind of a visual unpacking. And in this case, as you can see from the photograph, this is what the sewing machine looks like when it's in its sort of table mode. And we're literally in the studio unpacking it. And that's how it nests in its little cavity. And then that's what you end up with when you pop it up. This is like a super standard view, this sort of straight on from the side. What's great about photography in this particular context is if you really want to see something well, actually the best thing you can possibly do is try to draw it. However, if I was going to try to draw everything, I would probably be 100 objects into our collection of 20,000, and it would be an endless, non-ending project. But in this case, I'm able to capture a nice high-resolution image of the sewing machine, and you can tell already there is so much detail there. There's a ton of things to see, from the various mechanisms to the really ornate details. I'm a huge fan of the three-quarter view. I use this in my work all the time. It really helps to provide the image, well, it helps convey the three-dimensionality of the object. In this case, it really was useful in showing the ornamentation on that sort of faceplate. I don't know actually if there's a technical name for that, but faceplate. Three-quarter views are really important. I love manufacturers' details or makers' details or places where makers sign their work. In this case, this is on the top of the sewing machine's arm. I'm also a typophile. I love typography, so this was a great one, looking at this black letter typography and actually contrasting it with the cast singer in the cast iron base. So there's probably a little story there. Just those two details, I think you could already tease out probably some interesting decisions that were made in the making of this object. And I make sure when I'm working I try to never forget the hidden nooks and crannies. In this case, it turns out one of these drawers is filled with original bobbins of thread, and that kind of lumpy, waxy thing is actually, it's a cake of, I think is it beeswax? And that would be for waxing the thread. And that was all in that drawer. So I'm constantly unpacking things, looking at them from different angles, looking for details. The camera just has particularly if you're using macro lens, has an ability to capture detail that you may not see with the naked eye. And so that's what I'm constantly doing all the time at my job, and I believe it is very helpful for all the curatorial work that gets done at this collection, and sometimes I work outside Harvard as well. So there you go. Thanks.
Sammy was a real inspiration to us. Her photographs were just so wonderful. We knew we had to have this work in the Tangible Things book. And so the book is full of Sammy's photographs. The website that goes with the book is full of even more. So the way in which she teaches us how to look at a thing with real attention and detail is something I think we can all learn from. Now, we thought, because we know each other so well, that we would have a little bit of a battle this evening, a bit of a contest, rather than just do something bland and ordinary. We thought that we would make cases, as Laurel was saying earlier, why this thing belongs in a particular Harvard collection, and sort of duke it out. And so it's my role, which is maybe appropriate, maybe not appropriate, to say why this thing should be associated with art and why it belongs in the Harvard Art Museums. Okay, it's a beautiful thing. Not only the form, but the decoration. Look at this amazing black and gold and silver decoration. This is a form of decoration that in the mid-19th century is associated with Greco-Roman revival decorative schemes. But you will all have noticed the Sphinx that crops up at least twice, I think 3 times on this machine. The Sphinx, well, we all associate the Sphinx with ancient Egypt. And here's a photograph that's already in the Fogg Art Museum by an Armenian photographer working in Cairo in the late 19th century. But Sphinxes are not only Egyptian. They're part of the extensive Greco-Roman world. And there are plenty of Sphinxes in the Harvard Art Museums. Here is a Greek example on a terracotta plaque. And here, even closer, I think you'll agree, because it uses this, the same palette, is a detail of a black figure neck amphora from the 6th century BC. And here you can see on the right is the Sphinx. This is the palette that was used in this Greco-Roman revival in the middle of the 19th century. So this belongs in the Harvard Art Museum. Where better to put it? Well, I'm no longer at Harvard. I can nominate another museum for this, another art museum, and I'm going to choose the Sterling and Francine Clark Art Institute in Williamstown in the western part of Massachusetts. Many of you will know it. And here we see the original building, which is still there. There have been plenty of additions over the years, that opened in 1955. Sterling Clark is in the middle here, standing in this very cute manner with 2 of his 3 brothers. They were the children, the grandchildren of the guy there on the left, Edward Clark. Edward Clark, how did he become as wealthy as he did? Well, he was Isaac Merritt Singer's attorney. And he was on the board of the Singer and Company from 1851 when it started. And he raked it in. And his grandchildren, the 4 brothers, never had to lift a finger in their lives. And what did they spend their money on? Well, Sterling, who we see here with his wife Francine at the opening of the Clark Art Institute in 1955, Sterling and his brother Stephen collected art. Major collectors of art. Stephen was on the board of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Sterling founded his own institution. It was originally going to be in New York, too explosive in the 1950s, too vulnerable to nuclear attack, so out to rural Massachusetts, and that's where it is. The Clark continues to collect. And here we see a piano designed by Lawrence Alma Tadema in 1884, finished in 1887, that was made for Henry Marquand for his Greco-Roman music room in New York. It's the same basic decorative scheme as our sewing machine. You can spin round on the piano stool from the keyboard to the sewing machine without missing a beat. So this is, I think we should consider sending this to the Clark Art Institute. And you can see also, the Sphinx is right there on the leg of the piano. So, let's bring it back to Harvard, though. I do have a sort of residual loyalty to this place after having been here for 20 years. It still could go to the FOG, or the Harvard Art Museums, rather, on the grounds that it belongs to the Fluxus movement, a movement of art in the 1960s and 70s. The impresario was the artist George Masunas. We see the kind of thing that he and his colleagues, fellow Fluxus artists, made using ordinary things, designating ordinary things as artworks, altering them often in somewhat witty ways. We see Ben Vautier's Total Art Matchbox use these matches to destroy all art, museums, art libraries, and the rest of it. So this, strangely enough, is closely related to the sewing machine. This is a box for a catalog, a sort of keepsake, for an exhibition by Yoko Ono, who was a leading Fluxus artist in 1971 in Syracuse, New York. You see the box at the top left there. It's a puzzle box. It's made of white leatherette. It opens out, as you see to the right, with these compartments in which various keepsakes and documents to do with the exhibition could be kept. It's inspired by the puzzle box for accessories for this very sewing machine. And if that isn't enough to convince you that this is where it belongs, this is what it looks like when it's opened. That is the box that goes with this machine, but its absolute twin is already in the Harvard Art Museums, designated as an artwork, as a ready-made. So here is where it belongs, in the Harvard Art Museums. And I defy my colleagues to make a better case for technology and ethnography or whatever they are.
Ivan. When I look at this sewing machine, I don't think of the art museums or even the Semitic with its sphinxes. I think about technological systems. Now, when we think of this sewing machine as an object that's produced and used, we see it at the nexus of a whole web of technologies and sciences. First, there's the act of sewing, one of the oldest technologies in the world. There's agriculture and the economic botany of cotton, which is fraught with all kinds of labor and environmental issues. There's the technology of spinning yarns and weaving cloth. There is the geological science and metallurgy of sourcing iron and casting it and working it. There are engineering and mechanics, commerce, marketing, transportation, and many other industries that go along with this technology, like garment industry. But let's have a closer look at our 1902 Singer Model 27 treadle sewing machine. Okay, well, sewing is tedious work, and the first attempts at devising mechanical devices to speed up sewing were very clumsy to use, and their stitches tended to unravel. So this Singer sewing machine, though, has none of these problems. Well, why? Why is it so much better than those early ones? Well, first of all, there's this thread path. So the thread from the spool, and maybe I can just come down here and quickly point this out. So the thread from the spool goes through a hook, and it comes down through these tension plates, up through another hook, down through another hook, and goes through the needle here. And the needle is pointed with its eye near the point. The fabric is fed automatically beneath the needle by what are known as feed dogs. Those are those toothy little things you see in that circle. And the machinery, as it feeds it through, makes the needle go up and down. Now, the next part of this sewing machine that's very important is this shuttle that you see here that it's like a bullet shape, that carries a bobbin that's wound with a second thread. So this, as the shuttle oscillates, the bobbin thread will loop around the top thread that's passing through the needle. And what this does is it creates a lock stitch, which you see here in this schematic diagram, where the top thread interlocks tightly with the bottom thread inside the fabric layers. So we owe all these innovations to this man, Elias Howe, who in 1846 patented the first machine in the United States that sewed a durable lock stitch and could be factory made in quantity. Now, as a boy, Howe worked in the textile factories of Lowell, Massachusetts from 1835 to 1837, and the power looms in the mills used what were known as flying shuttles. You see one here at the top of the slide, and these would carry a bobbin in the center. You see the gray spool, long and skinny, and it would carry, that had the weft threads or weft yarns, and that would be carried through the shed of the warp threads row by row, and thereby weave the fabric. Now, Howe's mill experience, I think, had given him the idea for a bobbin carried in a shuttle that traveled back and forth in a straight line under the bed of the sewing machine. And here you see his patent drawing with his bobbin highlighted there in blue, carried in the red shuttle. After the textile factories, Howe's next job was with the firm of Daniel Davis Jr. in Boston. Now, this was another source of inspiration. The Davis firm was an invention factory that produced telegraph equipment and many models of electromagnetic machines and engines. The collection of historical scientific instruments has dozens of these things from the Daniel Davis firm. And it was during Howe's employment with Davis that he invented his Lockstitch Patent machine. And if you look here at his patent drawing, you'll see how closely it tends to resemble the other things that were being produced by Daniel Davis's shop at this time. Well, Howe patented his machine in 1846, but he couldn't get financing to manufacture it. And to his dismay, Isaac Singer jumped in to make a bundle off of his design. Well, Howe then had to sue Singer for patent infringement. It was a long, drawn-out battle, lasted about 5 years, from 1849 to 54. And eventually he won the right to royalties. But in the end, he really never made a good go as a sewing machine manufacturer. So what did Isaac Singer, who was also from Boston at this time, bring to the table? Okay, besides stealing Howe's design, he did add a presser foot and this arm that came over that held the needle, which he patented in 1851. And he also brought to the table new mass production techniques to bring the cost down. But really, I think what's most important about Singer is his flamboyance and salesmanship. So to attract customers, Singer traveled to county fairs and hired rooms where he recited the Song of the Shirt, which you see here, Thomas Hood's 1843 poem on the plight of seamstresses, with fingers weary and worn, as the first line goes. It goes on to say, stitch, stitch, stitch in poverty, hunger, and dirt, sewing at once with a double thread, a shroud as well as a shirt. Okay, this is, meanwhile, while Singer was reciting this, he would have lovely women, like his mistress shown here, demonstrate the ease of machine sewing. So to hear Singer talk, one would think that clothes were just going to spew forth from the machine of their own accord, like we see in this cartoon from 1858. But the other important thing that Singer did was that he targeted housewives, not just commercial ventures and factories, as his primary customers. He introduced buying on credit in installments. Machines were ornamental and suitable in one's parlor, like we see here. And the sewing machine became a symbol of self-reliance and status. This machine in front of us is branded no less than 7 times. There was no mistaking. You don't have to look closely like, is that person wearing a fancy watch? You see this, you recognize it, it's from great distance. Now, Singer's vision of labor-saving, genteel technology, though, belies the fact that sewing machines represented more work for mother. And the domesticity embodied in this lovely machine divided well-off women from seamstresses in garment factories and in sweatshops. So we might therefore wonder whether the sewing machine was really the faithful friend of women the world over, as Singer's marketing literature proclaimed.
Well, those were pretty good arguments. But you know, Ivan, you know the Harvard Art Museums. They're not going to take our sewing machine. It needs to cost a lot more, right? And Sara, yeah, boy, that was interesting about the technology. And I can see, but science, scientific instruments, and Chessy, I'm not sure it really belongs in your collection either. And besides, you have made a really good argument for mine. My decision that this is a story about globalization, and this is an object that belongs in the Peabody Museum. Now, it's going to take me a minute to make that argument, and I'm going to have to sort of meander over to the Baker Library in the Harvard Business School, but I think I can make it. Now, as Sammy has shown us, this is a commodity. Look at that. The name all over the place. Singer, Singer, Singer Manufacturing is not an artwork. It is not a scientific instrument. There it is. But this fascinates me. This most boring part of the machine, as you look at it, patented, tells us that the various patents engaged in this very machine were developed from 1882 to 1891. In fact, we know that in 1893, not this exact machine probably, but the very same model, Model 27, was on display at the World's Columbian exhibition. Now, I understand, I hear tale that the Peabody Museum is planning to do an exhibit on the World's Columbian exhibition. So I think this object ought to be accessioned by the Peabody Museum. Let me tell you just a little bit, of those of you who don't know, about the amazing Chicago World's Fair. Missed the year of Columbian Centennial, but didn't matter. They had a great show in Chicago in 1893. And it was essentially divided into 2 parts, the main exhibition around the Great Basin, and the midway, which was the informal exhibition with the concessions and a lot of fun. So the Grand Court was illuminated with electricity as a display of American technological power. And the midway, the Ferris wheel, the first of its kind, was also lit with electric lights. But what was fabulous about the midway was the way it allowed people to vicariously travel the world. They could go to India. They could see Eskimos on snow, at least in the depth of the winter. They could see Africans. They could ride a camel on a pseudo-Cairo street. Now, Singer Manufacturing Company, by this period, was already one of the nation's first multinational corporations. They had opened their first foreign factory in Scotland in 1867, and by this point, their foreign sales outnumbered their domestic sales. By 1889, Singer had foreign manufacturing and sales representing the bulk of the company's revenues. And they had a terrific way of advertising. At the Columbian exhibition, they had displays in 3 buildings: in the main part, in the manufacturing and liberal arts, in the machinery hall, and then in one that is not on this map, focusing on shoes and leather. Machines could be adapted to many devices. In machinery and liberal arts hall, they created period rooms with all of the draperies and cushions and everything made on a Singer sewing machine. As far as I know, they have no exhibits on the Midway, but they brought the spirit of the Midway into their own exhibits through trade cards that they handed out to visitors. Trade cards featuring 37 different countries in the world where there were senior Singer agents selling sewing machine devices $1 down or whatever the currency was, trying to get people invested in their machinery. You could, via Singer Fantasy, travel to India. You could engage in Egyptomania. So it wasn't just the art of the Sphinx, it was very much the marketing power of Egypt in this period. Now, really and truly, did people buy these machines? They did. And the Peabody Museum can convince us that they did buy these machines. At least some folks in these foreign lands did. This has an amazing kind of description attached to it. It tells us that at the close of a recent war, the king of U in the Caroline Islands came to pay homage to the government of Manila. And as the best means of advancing and establishing a condition of things that would prevent all future outbreaks, the king was introduced to the great civilizer, the Singer sewing machine. And according to the Singer publicist, we have here his photograph now in an engraving, seated at the Singer sewing machine with his Secretary of State beside him. The Singer brochure argues this is absolutely authentic. Well, there you go. But as we know, missionaries and commerce travel together in the process of civilizing the world. And one of the great challenges of missionaries coming into the Pacific was to properly dress the women there, as they did here in these mission-style dresses from the Tahitian islands. And here, from our own Peabody Museum, is a child's dress made of tapa cloth, the native cloth made from pounding the bark of a native This was made in French Polynesia, and I can attest it was made on a sewing machine. The threads are still there, the hanging threads at the ends of the stitches, a machine-sewn missionary dress out of tapa cloth. And here's a second example, also from the Peabody Museum. Zululand. I don't know whether the Peabody has any articles made on a sewing machine from Zululand, but we are told by the Singer publicist that the sewing machine is going to show that the Zulu are not only accomplished in warfare, as this Peabody photograph attests, but they are also going to be forward in civilization, that the agent of the Singer Sewing Machine Company at Cape Town, South Africa, supplies both the European and native inhabitants with their machines. How do we think about this? How do we think about this march of civilization via the sewing machine? Well, Andy Gordon, a colleague of mine in the history department, has a fascinating book about the impact of the Singer sewing machine in Japan, and about ultimately the Japanese were able to take over with domestic manufacturing from Singer. But during that period of Singer exploitation of the markets in Japan was very interesting, the division that developed there between indigenous culture techniques and the imposition of Western-style clothing. You will notice in the Singer trade card, the woman who is sewing is wearing a kimono, and she is sewing a Western-style man's jacket. And in Japan, there was a very interesting resistance to sewing kimono on a sewing machine. It could only be made by hand, partly because the fabrics were very valuable, the stitches were done very loosely, so it could be taken apart for cleaning, perhaps once a year. So there was cultural resistance as well as acceptance of this great civilizer. So you see in this Japanese print, the woman sewing at the machine is in Western-style clothing. The woman leaning over and peering at her work, longingly or not, is dressed in kimono. So, globalization is it, folks. And don't you think the Peabody Museum needs this sewing machine in their display on the World's Columbian Exposition? One of our collaborators could not be here this evening, but she fortunately made a video making for a very good argument for this sewing machine going to her institution, the Chipstone Foundation in Milwaukee. And so Sara Carter is going to present her argument via video.
Today on the porch of the Chipstone Foundation in Milwaukee, and I'm just back from maternity leave, and I'm quite happy to introduce my son Paul to my colleagues here, John Brown, the director of the foundation, and Claudia Mooney, assistant curator and new media manager. And we're also here today to discuss an object, a Singer sewing machine that currently resides in Laurel Ulrich's study. And it's an object that we've been trying to find a home for a long time. And I thought we might take some time today to talk about it to see if an object like this sewing machine could fit in Chipstone's collections. So first, maybe we could think a little bit about what we normally collect.
Mm-hmm. The foundation historically has collected early American furniture up to about 1825, 1830 or so. English pottery, 17th, 18th, early 19th century, terminating about the same date, and American historical prints and maps of the same era. So we tend to collect pre-industrial things.
But lately we've expanded our collecting. For example, we've started collecting Dave Drake jars, which were made by an enslaved potter in Edgefield, South Carolina. We've also collected face jugs, which were also made by enslaved people in South Carolina.
So these are objects that become really important, both touchstones and evidence for telling stories about the past.
Exactly.
For helping us understand the lives of people we might not understand, but for those material things.
Exactly.
And where the sewing machine could fit into that is sort of fits into our interest in expanding the range of stories, the range of voices, the range of interpretive perspectives that can be brought. And obviously, an artifact like this does relate to some of the things in our collection.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we could think first of all about stylistically about the decoration on this sewing machine.
So you have ornamental gilding in kind of a classicized style with an image of a sphinx.
Yeah.
And we have a broad range of objects, be it English-made ceramics or a really wonderful Philadelphia chair, for example, that has a very similar griffin, pair of griffins painted on it, done in the same applied gilding style.
Well, another sort of story we could think about with this object could relate to the women who worked with it. We could think about this as a very gendered object.
Right, and Chipstone actually owns a Massachusetts circa 1800 sewing table, a work table, that you could relate to this object. It's an object with a bag at the bottom where you would put the needlework that you were working on. It's got drawers that you would pull out and a little writing surface that would come up. Yeah. And it was actually had locks, so it was one of the few pieces of furniture that was just meant for women, and that women could lock. They could keep whatever was their property inside, and it was just for them.
Yeah, and interesting you mentioned that it served all those multiple purposes, because this sewing machine would actually fold down, the hinges here would close, and you would have just a table. Mm-hmm. Similar to that much earlier sewing table.
Exactly.
Interesting. And in fact, if we did that, if we folded it and closed it in that way, it would look quite similar to a dressing table.
It would look close to a variety of early forms. So dressing tables, if one owned the table that went with this sewing machine, if you had the whole ensemble, that would give perhaps even more rationale for a place like Chipstone having it, because you could really say, well, it's the direct descendant of these tables that we have.
So we can think about this in this genealogy of furniture forms. Mm-hmm. In addition to thinking about the decoration, the decoration might tell us the form itself and the place it might serve in someone's home. Could also help us understand it a little more. Interesting. One concern that we might have in looking at an object like this is that it's not unique. Right? We're looking at a Singer Sphinx sewing machine. It's very specific, but that doesn't mean it's unique. There are countless examples of this object out there. In antique shops, in people's basements, maybe in some museum collection somewhere.
And on eBay.
And on eBay, exactly. And so, as a museum that typically collects things that are very special and very unique, that's something that could pose a challenge for us. But we do have some factory-made things in here.
Yeah, and in fact, one could argue again that it's not really a challenge for us, because one of the stories that we do tell, the 18th century and certainly into the 19th century is a period when that whole notion of handmade, handcrafting begins to get a little fuzzy, because you began to have furniture shops, for example, with machinery, powered saws, water-powered saws or steam-powered saws.
Right.
You began to have ceramics manufacturers making use of all kinds of modes of mass production,
right.
Whether you're talking cast ceramics, lathe or engine-turned ceramics,
right.
the application of transfer prints.
Right.
So many of the things in our collection, if not fully mass manufactured, were at least part of that evolution towards it.
So maybe it's a false dichotomy to say we have things that are handmade versus things that are factory made, because that's a long history and a long process that gets us from something that is totally made by one person in a shop to something that rolls off an assembly line.
At Chipstone, we are also very interested in making, in the creation of artifacts. This is another way this machine could fit into our collection. As a tool for sewing, as a tool for making. My Tangible Things collaborator and friend, Sara Schechner, was actually able to get this century-old sewing machine working. She uses to stitch the label onto the beautiful baby quilt she made for my son Paul. It reads, "For Paul, from Sara Schechner, 2014. While we can talk about the decoration and form of this object, it truly comes to life when we think about what it is capable of creating and the stories those creations may tell." After considering all of the ways this sewing machine may link to the Chipstone collections, we decided that while we may not be able to get the exact sewing machine that sits in Laurel's office, we really needed to get our own. We are in the process of acquiring our very own Singer number 27. Who knows what kinds of history we may be able to craft with it.
So how should we do this, Laurel?
I think we should go just in order of the presentation. So all those who believe that the Singer sewing machine belongs in an art museum, raise their hand. And you can only raise your hand once. Let's say 6.
All right, now, those who think it belongs in a collection of historical scientific instruments, let's see your hand.
Totally biased.
Nice showing.
All right, who will have it for the Peabody Museum?
Oh,
Look at that.
that's a winner.
Yeah. Should we send it to Chipstone?
No.
They're getting their own anyway.
Okay, so we have a little bit of time. Can everyone hear everything? Because we have this one mic, but it seems to me like, can people hear everybody speaking if we speak up? Because it will be easier, I think, if we don't have to keep passing the mic around. So does anyone have any questions? Okay.
You mentioned that this machine had been sort of given to you accidentally. Do you know anything more about the provenance of it?
This is really fascinating. I know nothing about the provenance of this machine except that it was purchased in New Hampshire. But what's really interesting is Andy Gordon has located 3 machines like this in Tokyo museums, and he has complete stories about one of them, which moved from the north of Japan into Tokyo before World War II and still works. So I think there are stories about these machines to be had.
We do know that this machine was made in Scotland at the factory there. And the reason we know that is that Singer, as part of their big multinational mass industrial technologies, gave it a serial number. And their serial numbers are keyed with their alphanumeric numbers. And they're keyed to where it was made as well as when it was made. So there are lists in archives and online where one can search for that particular serial number and assign it to how many were in the batch that it was made as part of and where it was made. But then after that, how it got to the United States, we don't know.
Actually, I'm going to let, since okay, I'm going to take questions. Go ahead.
So the thesis of this is that tangible things are tangible things. That doesn't make a lot of sense if you think about the expos. And in fact, they're still having expos. Anybody know that? They still have World Expos?
Yeah.
So there was a World Expo this year. It was in Milan. So I just happened to be there. And I can suggest to you that if you walk up and down the pathway of the World Expo in Milan, and you looked at the tangible things, they had nothing to do with being tangible things. Every single structure on that pathway was designed to communicate something about the country that had put up that structure. And the things that they were attempting to communicate were not about the things themselves. They were all about what the country wanted you to believe. For example, the large...
This is a speech, Dave.
So,
Why don't we continue this argument at my house?
So the question is... Well, I will just say that the largest buildings on the pathway were from the poorest countries.
Yeah, that's a really nice
And so
point.
that's my question,
Yeah.
in essence, is when you recognize that that's what the things were being used to do, what is it really about tangible things that matters? Is it really what the thing is, or is it what it's designed to communicate to the rest of the audience?
I think that was our point.
Yeah, it's all of these things. You can't pin down any given thing to one set of characteristics or purpose. They are radically unstable and change over time. They're used for purposes that could not be foreseen by the people who caused them to come into being. They are mutable. They are things that relate to the immaterial as well as the material. So that's why they're so bewildering and complicated.
And that's why this machine doesn't belong in the Peabody any more than in the collection of scientific instruments or in the Baker Library or in somebody's living room. That is, we make of it what we make of it in whatever setting we put it. And the central argument of our book, Tangible Things, is that we need to get out of our rigid categories of analysis of material museum objects and try to engage in more cross-museum and interdisciplinary scholarship, because any object is capable of telling multiple stories. So thanks for your lecture.
All right, next question.
So you must hear this many times, but my mother had one of those. And I learned to sew on one of these, and I just want to add to the 5 different ways of thinking about this, that it's a beautiful machine to use. It's a very tangible thing in the sense of you can touch it and use it.
And it's human powered.
Right, it's human powered.
It's a travel machine.
This machine is now in working order, and
a lot of work by Sara.
I had some help also from my husband. But we got it back to working order and cleaned it up, and you can have the opportunity to try it out at the reception. We will bring it, and I will demonstrate it for anyone who wants to see it run. And if any of you want to sit down and try to run it, we can show you how, and I have some cloth here, and you can see it really has a beautiful stitch, and you feel it is really sturdy, and as you said, Janet, it is really a pleasure to sew with it. I find myself coveting it, like I want to sew more things on it than just a label.
I was wondering whether Harvard has a formal process. I remember as working with journalists, I had someone call and there was a piece of amber that actually had both a rare orchid and a bee that was fossilized in the amber, and I can't remember if it's in the herbaria or in the MCZ, but both of them would have wanted it for this first pollination demonstration. And is there a process where things are cross-referenced, or people do actually make a decision and let the other collection know what you have?
Yeah, we do a lot, because when things are offered to the collection of historical scientific instruments, our first question is, does this fit our mission? Let's say it does it fit another museum's mission as well? And we will be in touch with those other collections to both let them know if we're taking it or to steer the donor to them, or to give the donor that option to help make that decision. So it is a collective process, and we often do cross-reference things from one collection to another. Say the archives may have lab notebooks that go with the instruments we have in our collection of scientific instruments. And our instruments may have gone on expeditions that were botanists went on, or people in the Peabody anthropology, or things that went to the World's Fair were in the same building as others. So we want to make a synergy between all these things that helps scholars, students, and others see that linkage for their own work and just for the interest of it.
I will say that at least 3 institutions at Harvard turned down this sewing machine because it didn't fit the collection policy, which, strictly speaking, doesn't fit any of them, which is part of our point here, I think.
It is part of our point, but we heard how our colleagues at the Chipstone Foundation were stretching points to accommodate this thing. And I think most collections could begin to work together much more effectively by stretching points. The matter that you bring up is extremely important within this university and in many other universities with major collections. And with not such huge collections, which is how do they talk to each other? And basically, I spent 2 years on attachment in the office of the provost addressing this very question. And basically, there's very little talk among the collections, at least there was when I was here. And it's something that really does impede scholarship, because so much of our scholarship, and this is our major point in our book and this evening, so much to do with scholarship depends on crossing these boundaries among these standard categorizations that are institutionalized by the museums and collections. We've got to get across these boundaries, because otherwise we can't think with these things in effective ways.
All right, someone at the back?
I was thinking that part of what you're saying is, are you saying that all objects are interesting and have lots of facets to them? And if that's the case, do you find yourself being romanced by really ordinary objects? Like you just study a fork, you're like, oh my god, I don't know.
Yes, I would say that's true, and one of the reasons we chose for our example today is a domestic object is we want to show that anything in our world can, with close inspection, tell a story. And the stories will vary, but something you have in a cupboard at home is going to tell a story, and multiple stories. And so we want people to be able to look at material culture, material objects, and begin to see them as evidence of feelings, politics, social beliefs, aesthetics, culture, historical beliefs, memory, all kinds of things. And not just say, this is a fork, and it's only for eating. Sometimes objects, their function does not fully define what they are.
And to elaborate that point, we're historians. I think all of us who presented tonight. I mean, we teach history, and we're trying to, it's a pedagogical point, that we're trying to get students attentive to the material world around them, and to see history as something that exists in their shoes, in their chairs, in the things that they use every day, and to become more curious and engaged about those things. History doesn't just come off the internet.
Our book has, though, since it is, we have, some 200 objects described in the book, and they are from Harvard's collections, and so there's some exceptionally wonderful things, like the hornbill that you're going to get to see up close, and Samuel Johnson's teapot and 100-year-old tortilla, and
Galapagos tortoise shell that inscribed Ship Abigail 1835.
Yeah. So they're things that tell, Harvard has some fantastic things that we were able to take advantage of for our exhibition and this book. But the bigger point is, so you'll have fun reading the book and seeing all these pictures of great, very curious things. But at the same time, our techniques for interpreting objects can be done with something as humble as a simple sewing machine or your shoe. So that we want to make sure you don't have to be at Harvard to only look at the world and interpret it so fully and deeply.
So I think that might be a good moment to remind everyone, please join us upstairs for the book signing, to see the hornbill, to maybe even have a chance to sew with the sewing machine. Please join me in thanking all our speakers.